In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about some tips and tricks you can use to speed up your code. As you start to build longer pieces of code in VBA, you can notice that your code could take upwards of several hours to execute properly. And so there are a few things that we can do to help speed that up significantly and hopefully bring that runtime down. So starting with some quick fixes, the first thing you can do is turn off the auto calculation. And this is something that Excel does automatically. It will, anytime you change a cell's value, it will find any cell that references what you just changed, and it will recalculate that cell as well. So when you're rewriting a whole lot of data in your actual Excel file, this can result in a whole lot of calculation that doesn't necessarily need to be done right at that moment. And so what we can do instead is we can force that calculation to wait until the end of our code or somewhere in the middle if we want to try to recalculate. So at the very beginning of your code, you can use the line Application.Calculation equals Excel calculation manual. And what this does is it changes the auto calculation property in Excel to wait instead of doing it automatically and only do it when we manually instruct Excel to recalculate everything. And we can force that recalculation by using worksheet's name, whatever the name is, .calculate, or specifying a range and then using .calculate. And so we can control more specifically what Excel is trying to recalculate rather than letting Excel recalculate everything anytime we change a value. And you'll want to reset this to be automatic calculation again at the very end of your code. So one of the last lines of your code should be Application.Calculation equals Excel calculation automatic, which resets to automatic calculation like we had before. Along those same lines, Excel automatically is going to try to continually update your screen, and this happens while your code is running. So as your code is rewriting data or pulling new data out, Excel is going to try to update your screen to show you that new data being written into your file step by step. And this can cause a huge delay in the amount of time it takes for your code to run as Excel tries to update its screen over and over again. And it'll also cause this really annoying flashing of your screen, which can be really overwhelming to look at. And so we can prevent that updating by using Application.ScreenUpdating equals false, which will both prevent the flashing and speed up your code significantly. And you're going to want to, again, reset that at the end of your code using Application.ScreenUpdating equals true. You can also turn off your status bar and turn off events to help things speed up as well. So Excel actually has a little status bar that shows up in the bottom right corner of your screen as your code runs. And you can manually code in how you want that status bar to update, or you can let Excel try to predetermine that for you. Now, when you have particularly long pieces of code, your display status bar actually freezes up usually in the middle of your code as Excel starts to get a little overwhelmed with everything else that it's trying to do. So it's actually better to just turn this off from the beginning of your code, and that way Excel isn't constantly trying to update a status bar. So we can do that using application.display status bar equals false, and then reset it using equals true at the end of your code. You can also turn off any events that might be set up to run in Excel. So you might have an event that executes when a value changes or when you change your worksheet, kind of similar to the fix that we talked about before with Excel auto-calculating things. So we can actually turn off this events that might show up or events that might execute as we're working in that worksheet or in that table. Or just in that file in general, using Application.EnableEvents equals false at the beginning of our code, and resetting it again using Application.EnableEvents equals true at the end of our code. And this will just prevent VBA from branching off and trying to run all of these different events as we're walking through our code, and that will save us a lot of time in the long run. Outside of these quick fixes, there are some general rules of thumb that you can follow that will help your code run much faster. So the first general rule of thumb is that every time VBA actually gets involved in your Excel file, every time it references your file to read data or activates your file to write data, that adds a good chunk of time to your code. So if you're constantly flipping back and forth between reading and writing data, moving back and forth between your code and your file, you're going to have a code that takes a long time to run. And so we can minimize those interactions by trying to move or read data in chunks rather than cell by cell. So we can take advantage of the range functions to reference entire ranges of data, or the list object function to reference an entire table of data, and we can convert that into arrays that we can use in our code. And that way we basically read that data once and we pull it into our code as a big array, and then we can use that array to pull out the specific pieces of information that we need. But because that array exists in our code and we're not flipping back and forth between the code and the file anymore, we save ourselves a lot of time. So it's best to read and write data in chunks rather than individually. You should also try to use the object hierarchy efficiently and take advantage of those with and end with statements that we've talked about to avoid having to retype that every single time. And this kind of goes back to if we were to step through that object hierarchy every time, it takes us a long time to actually type that out every time we want to do something, but it also takes Excel a minute or two to try to actually walk through that object hierarchy and figure out exactly what you're working with. So we want to try to avoid that as much as possible, which we can do with and with statements or being careful about where we're activating a particular sheet or a particular workbook. We should also avoid the worksheet functions that Excel has. So Excel has some intrinsic worksheet functions that you can use, like the max function or the min function or VLOOKUP and that sort of thing. And you can reference those in VBA, but it takes VBA a long time to read that line because it has to go into your Excel file, it has to find the corresponding internal Excel function that you're referencing, and it has to pull that back into your VBA code and apply the information that you want. So it takes a long time to reference worksheet functions, and it's better generally to just hard code that information in rather than using Excel's predetermined worksheet functions, because now you're not trying to switch back and forth between your code and your file to get that function. You can stay in your code and just hard code it in there so you don't have to reference your file at all. We also talked about this a little bit when we looked at the different variable types that there are, but it's best practice to avoid variant type variables, which means you should try to declare all of your variables at the beginning of your code as specifically whatever they are. So if they are text, you should declare them as text. If they're an integer, you should declare them as an integer, rather than letting Excel try to create a variant type variable that it's going to change every time you set that variable equal to something. So best to avoid variant variables. And the last thing, and this helps a lot, is don't use copy and paste. You can copy and paste in VBA. You can reference copy and paste functions, but it takes, again, VBA a long time to try to access your Excel file, run the copy functionality, and then access your Excel file again to run the paste functionality. And it takes a long time for Excel to actually execute that from VBA. Instead, you can set entire ranges equal to one another. So if you're trying to copy a column, for example, you can set column B equal to column A. And that way you're not copying and you're not pasting that data, but you can walk through and essentially copy and paste by setting each range equal to the copied range. And that way you're not using copy and paste, you're just using a range equals to a range, which is all done within VBA, executed within VBA, and doesn't require any access of the actual copy and paste functionality, so it runs a lot faster. So in this video, we talked a little bit about some quick fixes and some general rules of thumb that you can use to speed up your code, and I highly encourage you to use all of these to make sure your code is running quickly and efficiently.